Callen Drayton stood in front of the cameras, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice shaking as he pleaded for justice. Weston Drayton watched from the sidelines, his stomach twisting with unease. The world saw a grieving boyfriend, a man shattered by loss. But Weston saw the truth. He saw the lies in his brother's eyes, the cracks in his carefully constructed mask. And soon, the world would see them too. The quiet town of Ravenshire had never seen anything like it. In the early hours of a cold autumn morning, a chilling 911 call shattered the peace. A man's frantic voice, barely comprehensible through his sobs, pleaded for help. The dispatcher tried to calm him, but his words tumbled out in broken gasps. He had come home to find his girlfriend dead, their apartment ransacked, and blood pooling across the wooden floor. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights filled the narrow street, sirens cutting through the silence of the night. When officers arrived at the apartment, they were met with a horrifying scene. 24-year-old Nia Holloway, a promising art student with a bright future, lay lifeless in the dimly lit living room. Her body was positioned awkwardly, her face partially covered by a throw pillow, as though someone had tried to silence her final screams. Blood trailed from her nose, and faint bruises circled her neck. It was clear she had fought for her life. The room around her was in disarray, drawers flung open, picture frames shattered, and a lamp knocked over. It looked like a robbery turned. Violent, but something felt off. Standing in the middle of the chaos was Callen Drayton, Nia's boyfriend, his hands trembling, his face streaked with tears. He clutched his head, his breath ragged, his body swaying as though he might collapse at any moment. Officers guided him to a chair, speaking gently, asking him to recount what had happened. He was the one who had found her like this. He had. Been out all night, he said, drinking with friends. And when he returned, the apartment was like this. He hadn't touched anything, too afraid to move. His cries grew louder as he told them how much he loved her, how they had just spoken on the phone earlier that evening. She had been fine, laughing, her usual self, and now she was gone. Paramedics arrived, confirming what was already clear. Nia was dead. As crime scene investigators moved in, officers led Callen outside. His grief was overwhelming, his hands shaking as he wiped at his swollen eyes. Neighbors gathered, watching in hushed whispers as Callen crumbled onto the front steps. He sobbed into his hands, his entire body racked with despair. Reporters arrived not long after, cameras flashing as they captured the heartbroken young man whose life had just been torn apart. News channels ran headlines almost immediately, calling it a tragic case of a home invasion gone wrong. But detectives on the scene weren't convinced. Something about the crime scene didn't sit right. Despite the mess, nothing valuable appeared to be missing. Expensive electronics, cash left on the counter, even a laptop on the coffee table, all untouched. The door showed no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or shattered glass. If it had been a burglary, the intruder hadn't taken anything. And then there was the body itself. Nia's injuries suggested more than just a quick attack. There were defensive wounds, signs of struggle, bruising on her arms as if she had been grabbed. This wasn't just a random crime. Officers escorted Callen to the station for questioning, though they reassured him it was standard procedure. He complied without hesitation, still shaking, still lost in grief. He repeated his story. He had been out. He had come home. He had found her. He had no idea who could have done this. But as investigators examined the evidence, their unease grew. Something was wrong, and soon they would uncover a truth far more sinister than they had ever expected. Detectives began piecing together the timeline of Nia Vexley's final hours, determined to find the person responsible for her death. Callen Drayton, her grieving boyfriend, had been cooperative from the start, answering every question with a shaky voice and downcast eyes. He insisted that he had spent the night drinking with friends, only to return home and find the horrific scene waiting for him. He swore he had no idea who would want to hurt Nia. But the details of his story weren't adding up. Security footage from the bar where Callen claimed to have been all night told a different story. While he had arrived with a group of friends, he had left much earlier than he had told detectives. Surveillance cameras outside his apartment complex showed him walking up to the front door around midnight, hours before he called 911. Investigators knew they had to be careful. A grieving boyfriend who had just lost his partner in such a brutal way would naturally be distraught and confused. But there was a difference between being shaken by tragedy and outright lying. Neighbors were questioned, and a few reported hearing loud noises from the apartment that night. One elderly woman across the hall mentioned that she had heard something heavy fall, followed by muffled shouting. Another neighbor, coming home from work, had seen Callen pacing outside the building. Just after midnight, his head down, his hands buried in his pockets. He had looked nervous, as if he was waiting for something. When asked if he had noticed anything unusual, Callen had insisted that everything had seemed normal when he returned home. But the evidence suggested he had been at the scene much earlier than he claimed. The forensic team soon found more troubling signs. The apartment, while appearing ransacked at first glance, had no real signs of forced entry. The door hadn't been kicked in, the windows hadn't been tampered with, and there were no pry marks anywhere on the locks. Whoever had entered that apartment had done so without struggle, meaning Nia had likely let them in. If it had been a burglary, it was an unusual one. The most glaring clue was that nothing of value had been stolen. Money, jewelry, and electronics were all in plain sight, untouched. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Under Nia's fingernails, forensic experts found traces of DNA, skin cells scraped from her attacker during what had been a desperate struggle. If she had fought back, it meant she had likely known her killer. It hadn't been a random act of violence. Someone close to her had done this. Callen, still caught up in the whirlwind of grief and media attention, had a small cut on his hand that hadn't been there the night before. He had claimed he got it while moving furniture earlier that week, but investigators weren't convinced. The placement of the wound and the fresh appearance suggested otherwise. Detectives pressed Callen about the inconsistencies in his story, but he stuck to his version of events. He maintained that he had nothing to do with Nia's death. He continued to weep at her vigil, speaking about how much she had meant to him, how they had planned a future together. He even pleaded for the killer to be found, standing in front of the cameras with tear-streaked cheeks and a trembling voice. The public sympathized with him, seeing him as a man whose world had just been torn apart. But behind the scenes, investigators were growing more certain that Callen wasn't telling the whole truth. As the pressure mounted, someone else was watching from the sidelines. Weston Drayton, Callen's older brother, had remained quiet during the days following Nia's murder. He had seen the news coverage, heard the police statements, and watched as his brother continued to play the role of the devastated boyfriend. But Weston knew something the rest of the world didn't, and that secret was about to change everything. Weston Drayton had always known his younger brother to be reckless, but he had never imagined he would be capable of something like this. As he watched Callen break down on television, pleading for justice for Nia, something inside him twisted. It wasn't just grief he saw. It was performance. The way Callen sobbed, the way he covered his face, the way he paused between words as if choosing them carefully, it all felt too controlled, too rehearsed. Weston had seen his brother in real distress before, and this wasn't it. A week before Nia's murder, Callen had come to him, frustrated and angry. He had been drinking, his words slurring as he ranted about how things with Nia were falling apart. Weston had only half listened, assuming it was just another argument between them. Callen and Nia had a turbulent relationship, with breakups, and makeups happening so often that Weston had stopped keeping track. But that night was different. Callen had said something that sent a chill down Weston's spine, something he couldn't shake now that Nia was dead. If she thinks she can just walk away from me, she's got another thing coming. At the time, Weston had brushed it off as drunken nonsense. Now, with all the evidence stacking up, it felt like a confession before the crime had even happened. Weston tried to tell himself that it was just a coincidence, that his brother wasn't a killer. But there were too many signs pointing in the opposite direction. The way Callen had lied about his whereabouts, the suspicious cut on his hand, the fact that there was no forced entry, it was all too much to ignore. The final push came when Weston received an unexpected call from an old friend, Leo Henshaw, who worked at a security company. Leo had seen the case all over the news and remembered something strange from the night of the murder. He handled security footage for a parking lot not far from Callen's apartment. As a favor, he checked the recordings and saw Callen's car parked there much earlier than he had told the police. Not only that, but Callen had been sitting in his car for nearly 20 minutes before finally walking inside. The timestamp placed. Him at the scene around the time Nia was likely killed. Weston felt sick. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of it crushed him. Turning in his own brother wasn't just betrayal, it was severing the bond they had shared since childhood. But Weston also knew Nia didn't deserve to be forgotten. She deserved justice, and Callen deserved to pay for what he had done. He made his way to the police station, his hands clammy, his heart pounding. As he sat across from the detectives, he laid everything out. The threats Callen had made, the inconsistencies in his alibi, the security footage showing him at the scene earlier than he admitted. He told them about the way Callen had been acting. Ever since the murder, how his grief seemed more like an act than genuine sorrow. The detectives listened carefully, nodding as Weston spoke. He could see in their eyes that they had suspected Callen all along, but had been waiting for the final piece to make their case airtight. His confession gave them exactly what they needed. By the time Weston left the station, his hands were shaking. He had done the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. The brother he had grown up with, the one he had once protected from schoolyard bullies, was about to be arrested for murder. And this time, Weston wouldn't be able to save him. The morning Callen Drayton was arrested, he was still playing the role of the grieving boyfriend. He had scheduled an interview with a local news station, continuing to push the narrative that Nia's killer was still out there. His voice trembled as he spoke about his love for her, his eyes welling with tears at just the right moments. He begged the public for information, urging anyone who knew anything to come forward. He had no idea that someone already had. As the police approached his apartment, Callen was sitting on his couch, scrolling through messages of sympathy on his phone. He had fooled almost everyone. Friends, family, even strangers online were mourning alongside him, offering their condolences. He had played his part so well, convincing the world that he was a heartbroken man desperate for justice. But the moment he heard the knock on his door, something inside him shifted. The officers didn't hesitate. As soon as he opened the door, they moved in, restraining him before he could even process what was happening. The shock on his face was genuine. He had thought he was untouchable. He had been so careful, so meticulous in crafting his alibi. Yet here he was, being pulled from his home in handcuffs, flashing cameras capturing every second of his downfalls. He was shoved into the back of the squad car. Callen kept asking why. Over and over again, he demanded answers, as if he couldn't fathom how the police had unraveled his carefully constructed lies. The officers didn't respond. They didn't need to. Callen would soon find out the betrayal had come from someone he never expected. At the station, the weight of his arrest finally sank in. Gone was the composed, sorrowful boyfriend who had won over the media. Now Callen was panicked, pacing, the interrogation room, his mind racing. He still believed there had to be a mistake, that somehow, some way, he would talk his way out of this. Then the detectives laid out the evidence. The security footage, proving he had arrived at his apartment hours before he claimed. The DNA found under Nia's fingernails, which had already been matched to him. The inconsistencies in his alibi, the neighbors who had heard the struggle, the untouched valuables proving this was never a burglary. Piece by piece, they dismantled every lie he had told. But it was the final blow that made Callen freeze. His brother, Weston, had turned him in. For a long moment, Callen couldn't breathe. He replayed every memory he had with Weston, every fight they had gotten into, every time Weston had stood up for him. His own brother had walked into a police station and handed them the key to his downfall. That was when the panic turned to rage. Callen slammed his fists on the table, shaking his head violently. He called Weston a liar, a traitor, a jealous coward, who wanted to see him fail. But his outburst didn't matter. The detectives had heard it all before. No amount of denial, no anger, no excuses could erase the evidence stacked against him. As the realization sank in, Callen's energy drained. He sat back in his chair, staring at the wall. There was no way out. His carefully orchestrated plan had crumbled. His lies had been exposed, and the one person he had always trusted had made sure there was no escape. When the detectives finally asked if he had anything to say, Callen remained silent. He had played the victim for so long, but now there was no one left to believe him. The courtroom was packed on the day of Callen Drayton's trial. Reporters filled the seats, cameras flashing as he was led inside in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled. The once charismatic man who had convinced the world of his innocence now looked hollow, his eyes sunken, his confidence shattered. The weight of his betrayal, his lies and his crimes, had finally settled on his shoulders. The prosecution wasted no time painting Callen as a manipulative and dangerous man. They detailed how he had plotted the murder, how he had lured Nia into his apartment that night, pretending to want a civil conversation about their relationship. The forensic evidence showed she had fought back, scratching at his skin as he strangled her. The bruises on her arms told the story of a struggle, her final desperate attempt to escape the man she had once loved. Callen's defense attorney tried to counter with claims of circumstantial evidence, insisting that no one had seen him commit the crime. But the facts were undeniable. The security footage placed him at the scene, his DNA was under Nia's fingernails, and there was no sign of forced entry. He had lied to the police, changed his story multiple times, and most damning of all, his own brother had testified against him. Weston sat on the witness stand, his expression unreadable as he told the court everything he knew. He spoke about the threats Callen had made, the suspicious behavior after Nia's murder, and the overwhelming guilt he had felt once he realized the truth. He told them about the moment he knew, without a doubt, that his brother had killed her. The betrayal was evident in his voice, but there was no regret in his testimony. He had done what needed to be done. Callen didn't look at Weston as he spoke. He kept his head down, his jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. But anyone watching could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. He had spent his whole life believing that Weston would always have his back, that no matter what, his brother would never turn on him. Yet here he was, the one person responsible for putting him in that chair, facing a lifetime in prison. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the jury needed only a few hours to reach their verdict. When the foreman stood to read the decision, the entire courtroom held its breath. Guilty. Callen barely reacted. He sat still, his face void of emotion, as the judge announced his sentence. Life in prison, with no chance of parole. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every moment, every flicker of emotion that crossed his face. The man who had once demanded justice for Nia now had justice served against him. Weston watched as his brother was led away, knowing this was the last time he would ever see him as a free man. There was no relief, no satisfaction, only a hollow emptiness that he knew would never fully go away. He had done the right thing, but it had come at a cost. He had lost his brother, his family name was forever stained, and no matter what he told himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had destroyed the only person who had ever truly needed him. As he walked out of the courthouse, the cold air stung his face. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, asking how he felt about the verdict. He ignored them, pushing through the crowd. None of them would ever understand. None of them knew what it was like to turn against blood, to choose justice over family. The case would fade from the headlines in time, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies. But for Weston, it would never be over. He would carry the weight of his choice for the rest of his life. And Callen, the brother he once protected, would spend the rest of his days behind bars, alone with the truth he could no longer escape.